Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight we are going to be discussing Rwanda's 24th year of liberation since the genocide in 1994 against the Tutsi. We're going to be looking most importantly at the role of people who have been at the forefront of this struggle starting 24 years ago, and also looking at the role of youth in carrying forward the legacy of our liberators. Joining us tonight on The Square is Colonel Jill Rutaremara, who is the director of the Rwanda Peace Academy. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. We're also joined by Alain Daishimiye, who is a commissioner at the Rwanda Patriotic Front in charge of ICT. Alain, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for having me as well.
As always, The Square is made up by Forrest and Pandas. My name is Diana Mpisi, and I'm also here with Berna Namata. Berna, always a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
And Ephraim Ramgenje, great to see you. Charles, unfortunately, can't be with us today, but he will be following the show from where he is away on business. As we usually do, we have these highlights of the week that, you know, we kind of look at before we go into the thick of things. I would like to ask you, Ephraim, is there something so far this week? It's been a slow one. There was a public holiday before, another one today. Is there something that you like to pick out? That
Felt like a weekend. The way I was even talking, I thought I was going back to work on Sunday. But I'd say for me, the highlight of the week, I'll go back to it like we discussed the previous show right before the World Cup started, is the World Cup. There have been many surprises, and there was a game, a really interesting game between Belgium and Japan. Belgium came from behind 2-0 down to winning the game in the last minute. It was actually a bit sad, but I mean, that's football. So yeah, I would say that was one of the highlights of my week amongst many. But yeah.
Berna?
For me, it's been the recent launch of there's this Smart Million project. I don't know how much it cost the First Lady, the homes for the vulnerable members of our society. I think we need to see more of that. It would be great if the private sector could learn from that and do more for our vulnerable members of the society.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you for joining us, to our guests. Tonight is a very significant day in Rwanda. It's 24 years marking liberation from the 1994 Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi. And some of the things we want to discuss are focused on that, on this particular day. And my first question is to you, Colonel Rutaremara. You know, you were our age, if not younger, when you began this journey of sacrifice and dedication to really bring Rwanda to where it is today, over 24 years ago. This is a celebration. Today is a celebration, I think, across the country, but it's also a somber reminder that the genocide was stopped officially on this day. And for us here, our question for you and to our audiences, especially our youthful audiences, is if you can share with us your personal experiences on what inspired you to go into this particular cause, and what kept you dedicated to this particular cause?
Thank you. First of all, I wish to thank the Blue Oceans and the Rwanda Broadcasting Agency for inviting the RDF to this talk show, The Square. As far as my age is concerned, I'm not sure whether I was your age, because first of all, I don't know what your age is. But what I can tell you is that in 1990, October, when I joined the Rwandan Patriotic Army, I was slightly over 30 years. And so from there, I think you can guess whether it was your age or not.
I think you are younger than us.
Okay. So, back to your question, what inspired me as a person? I come from a background of biological sciences and also political sciences. I believe that human beings are shaped by two factors. There is a genetic makeup, that one I will not even go into details, but there is also the environment under which one grows. In the sense, when you talk about the environment here, we are talking about anything, the food you eat, the people you interact with, the family in which you grow, your life experience, and and so on. So these are things that shape a human being. Now, back to me, I was born in this country, Rwanda. I fled to Uganda with, of course, with my parents. And in Uganda, being a refugee, the experience was not good. It was not rosy. We grew up in refugee camps. I sometimes tell people that, and that's a joke, that I can't pay my money going to a national park because I grew up among lions, among buffaloes, among, name it, hyenas, lions, leopards, number of birds and so on. A lot of diseases in those areas, flies and so on. So the areas were not good. We went to schools in Uganda. Of course, being refugees, we were discriminated against. And I think that applied to many refugees. I had parents who had been detached from their families, had been dislocated. Some of their relatives were in Rwanda. They could not visit their relatives. I had also relatives who were chased from Uganda in 1982, fled to Rwanda, and then forced back again into Uganda. That was in 1982 during Obote II's regime. Getting a job in Uganda was also not easy, leave alone a good job. So I went to school in Uganda. After Uganda, I worked in Kenya. I never actually worked in Uganda. I worked in Kenya. In Kenya, the situations were also not very different. You had to have a work permit, and actually we're always being reminded that you are doing this job as long as there is no qualified and competent Kenyan to do the job, and it was categorically stated in our work permits. So the question that kept cropping up was, why should I anyway deserve what Ugandans deserve, or even Kenyans, when you are a refugee anyway? So that was one of the problems. So then, of course, if I can move from that, I was talking about the environment. I was talking about, we had families, of course, but we joined also other organizations, some of which were cultural. Like in Rwanda, I happened to be the chairman of Rwanda's Welfare Foundation at Makerere University. It was cultural, but with some political elements. Then finally, later on, I joined the Rwandese Alliance for National Unity, RANU. And later on, 1987, when RANU was changed to RPF, I still became, of course, a member of RPF, and also held the modest leadership position within the RPF, especially in Kenya, where I was working. So I learned a lot of things as a member of RPF. So what did I learn? One was that, first of all, I was not the only person with the political problems. Two, I was also not the only person searching for a solution to those problems. There were other Rwandans who had similar problems, be it refugees or even non-refugees, those who were living in Rwanda and also in the diaspora. We also attended the cadre development schools and also participated in teaching in cadre development schools. And I think from my experience, if I give you my background, I came to learn that, first of all, I came to understand the character of the state in Rwanda and also the weakness of a dictatorial regime, and actually what it takes to defeat a dictatorial regime. But that I'm talking about the theory now. And this was inspiring, and as we did that, even with colleagues, we could also discuss various examples, case studies in Vietnam, case studies in Cuba, That's what RPF was actually involved in. And all this gave hope that if other people could do it, that even Rwandans could achieve the same.
Absolutely.
So this was, of course, it was an inspiration, and I think it is that history that shaped me. But to add on, we also participated in mobilizing the youth. And I think I looked at it as being unfair if we were involved in the mobilization of the youth, finally to fight and liberate their country, and then when it comes to the actual D-Day, then you take a back seat. So I think I also thought that it would maybe that would also be unfair. So in the nutshell, I think those are things that inspired me, especially the patriotic element, because that is something that was emphasized, and no wonder that even the RPF came with the name of the Patriotic Front, because it was something that key as a value that was emphasized. Another thing that was actually always being emphasized wherever I were, whether in discussions and in readings, was the primacy of collective interest over individual interest. That time, of course, we had no national interest to talk about, but at least you could see that it is important that people take a collective interest rather than individual interest. And that's what patriotism is all about, because it is about a love for the country. And when you love the country, of course, it's not loving the land, it's loving the people. And if I think you imbibe that, then it's a good inspiration. Yeah.
My friend Brenda, is there something you'd want to add to this very edifying personal account of Colonel Rutaremara?
Yeah, it's actually, you know, as a young Rwandan, and I think that's what we're talking about, the role of the youth in carrying this forward. There's always, when you hear these stories, because they're so individualized, they continue to add to the bigger picture. Imagine, all the time when I hear these stories, it's like another piece or pieces being added to a jigsaw puzzle that tells the entire picture of what people went through. And if you wouldn't mind, I would want to pose a question to the Colonel.
Yeah, sure.
At what point did you realize the scale of impact the liberation could have as an individual when you made that decision to join the RPA, or even just be involved and even begin this liberation struggle to liberate Rwanda, or begin the struggle to liberate Rwanda? At what point did you realize the potential it had? Because I know there's always that point where you're like, okay, I'm getting involved because I want to go back home, but there's a point where you realize this can actually be something, we can actually achieve this, and this can liberate Rwanda and actually help us in establishing a state that has dignity and agaciro.
Yeah, first of all, as the Rwanda Patriotic Army, or even before that, it was very clear that it was an ideological kind of army that was guided by a certain ideology. It was actually partisan, so to say, because there was a political program that is laid down. So the issue was, how do we put this political program into practice? Given the fact that there is an adamant regime in Rwanda, adamant because of the military might that it had, adamant because of the external support that it had. So we are convinced that one of the solutions would be to break the back of the military. But of course, back to what you are asking, the issue then would be being kind of inferior in terms of numbers, in terms of weapons, in terms of support, and so are we actually going to make it? That is the question that I think everybody had. But I think, again, the consolation was, and I go back to what I've been saying, that this thing has been done even in the past. Forces that seemingly looked weak have defeated even forces that actually looked very strong.
Yeah.
And that's why I think our case studies and bringing up the youth was important by discussing such examples, because they were ample examples of liberation movements. If you talk about, you go to Mozambique, if you go to Cuba, if you go to China, if you go to Vietnam, and so on. So I think the issue of conviction, at least theoretical conviction, is very important. And then there was, at the back of everybody again was, if you don't do it, what else is going to happen? You do not have any dignity because you are a refugee. So you either accept to remain in that situation or you don't. But of course, there was also a theoretical underpinning of the possibility to achieve what we intend to achieve. Because we knew the weakness of a dictatorial regime. We had a just cause. The objective conditions were there. And actually, we came to realize, all of us, that after all, the issue is not the refugees. Those even who claim to be in Rwanda and who have a country, so to say, are also, some are even in a worse state than we are in.
Yeah.
So, and I think this was also a kind of consoling and also a motivating factor.
Yeah, Bernard, do you want to say something? I
Yes.
would like also to get to Alain, but please just...
First of all, just to say that it is quite humbling sitting next to him and listening to, this story. Someone who has been actually on the ground, actively involved. We owe you so much, and it's a great privilege to be seated next to you. I just wonder if you could just give us a sense of, looking back 24 years, what sort of country did you inherit? And how did that inform the next steps in, nation building?
Yeah, that has always been stated by many people. We inherited the kind of a failed state. In 1994, this country was dead. Over 1 million people, Tutsis killed, hundreds of thousands of widows and orphans, and other people who are disabled. The economy was completely shattered. The banks were looted. There was no physical infrastructure. There was actually no functioning institution save for the RPA, which was also a young institution. So the RPA was involved in all sorts of things because the judiciary was not there. There was no police to speak of. There was no local government. So you can imagine we had a lot of insecurity. Neram were roaming all over the country, still killing people. Others were reorganizing in the former Zaire. So the situation was actually bad. There was also a lot of mistrust and suspicions among Rwandans, and that was also a big problem. So it took, I think, strong leadership to bring all people together and start remaking Rwanda into a formidable country. So if you ask me where we are now, I should say at least we are pleased where we are now. Although, of course, liberation is a process. There is, of course, much more that can be achieved. For example, when I see this research work being done, you realize that, of course, national unity is maybe around 90-something%. But you see, we still have some remnants of, for example, genocide ideology. So those are things that still Rwandans will have to grapple with. Because even those small things which are, we have Rwandans who have been uplifted, over 1 million people have been uplifted out of poverty. But the question again can be asked, what about even the few ones who are still within those poverty lines? So I think much has been done, and I think we are very happy. But at the same time, we can't say we are satisfied with what has been done. So that's why I think we believe that with all Rwandans, we should continue with the liberation process.
What did you learn from that whole complex process that has sort of informed your way forward? What are some of those key lessons?
One of the key lessons is that, first of all, it is Rwandans who can solve their problems. You can get assistance, but you have to solve your problems. Two, that we have to understand our own context. And I think that's why if you look at the issues like homegrown solutions, they have really delivered a lot of results, simply because it's a way that Rwandans are looking for solutions from within. And I think what has helped this country is dialogue, inclusiveness, and the ability to look for solutions from within, and based on your own context, your own history, your own culture, and so on.
And I'd like to bring this to the next point. Alain, if I would like to ask you, we've spoken about this. I think the next step is actually for young people in this country to take and carry forward the mantle that has been set to us by our predecessors. If I remember correctly, there was a senior official who once said that it would be the ultimate betrayal if young people actually did not continue with this journey that has been put in place for the last 24 years. You're recently appointed as a commissioner at the Rwanda period at RPF in charge of ICT. And I'd like to ask you, what is the role of youth and you as an active young member of society in taking forward this particular narrative?
Okay, thank you, Diana. I want to take this opportunity as well to thank Blue Oceans and RB as well for giving us a platform today to discuss on this important topic, and also to thank all the lives and everybody that participated in the liberation that we celebrate today. To answer your question, I'm going to go back to what the Colonel has said. When he was talking, I was thinking about two things. The liberation of Rwanda demonstrates the constructiveness and the destructive power the youth has. On one hand, we have a group of youth that is idle, that is stricken by poverty, that is being exploited by the then government to participate in these heinous crimes we all know about. On the other hand, we have another group of youth of similar age that have been denied their rights and forced into exile. And he kept on talking about the different conditions, life conditions that they were in. And it also brings, one of the things His Excellency said, they had three options: either to fight, either to flee, or either to give up. But due to these conditions, we see that the only option on the table was fight. So for us to be here, it's the fight for the cause. And in the sense, they have paved way and given us the foundation as the youth to continue the struggle. We're not fighting bullets anymore, we're not fighting the genocide anymore, but we have different struggles that we face today. As the youth, the first thing I believe that we should focus on is on safeguarding the foundation that was set by those who came before us. Because just like a house, if the foundation is not strong, the house will crumble and fall. So by safeguarding those achievements and also keeping in mind the history and the past that we went through, I think it's necessary for us to first begin by protecting what we have. Secondly, he mentioned a point of not depending on foreign help or foreign donations as well. I believe we should free ourselves from trying to get solutions from outside or from neighbors, but rather than looking elsewhere, we first look what we have, how can we participate individually, and what solutions can we come up with individually to move on. Thirdly, is security and peace. Without security and peace as well, there's no national development. So as the youth, I believe that it's our duty to maintain the security and the peace. And I take this opportunity as well to thank all the men and women and the youth that's out there tonight that's protecting us in different areas so that we can enjoy the night as we sit here tonight. So I believe the youth also should be involved in protecting its security and also designing its peace. Another thing too, you talked about context. We need to also examine the realities on the ground and also collaborate as the youth and engage each and one of us into problem solving with regards to the situations that we face today. For example, unemployment. The youth can sit down and use their skills and aspirations and their talents drive it into entrepreneurship in one or another. We're talking about eradicating poverty instead of sitting at home or enjoying the leisures of the liberation. I'm sure by volunteerism, some of these problems we can solve them. So those are the few things from this first conversation that we have had that I believe necessary to be the building blocks of the future ahead of the youth.
I'd just like to ask you something on that, and this is to the next part of this conversation, which is apathy. And people across the world, youth globally have been called apathetic, whether, they don't vote, they don't like to participate in leadership roles. And coming down to Rwanda specifically, these events, whether it's Kwibuka, whether it's, like, for instance, the celebrations of liberation, it's difficult to get youth in. And some say maybe it's because, their lifestyles, they're more pampered than, let's say, Afande here, who, the struggle was real, and maybe this generation doesn't understand what happened, in the past to get where we are today. And as a youth leader, why do you think this is the case? And of course, Colonel, I would also feel free to also give your 2 cents on this. But why is it that, based on public perception, youth are considered not engaged in leadership roles?
I really don't believe that they're passive in a sense, but I believe it's also the role of those that are in charge to engage the youth as well. Let me start by giving the figures of Africa. If you look at Africa, 70% of Africa is the youth. It's under the age of 30. And this demographic dividend is a resource for social and economic growth. So it is, I believe that it's time for governments or those in charge to start engaging, because the youth are not only the leaders of today, but of tomorrow, but also the partners of today. So the many problems we face today will carry on to the next generation. So by saying that the youth is passive to what's going on, or for example, you gave an example of Rwanda, they're not active in certain events that make sense to their context, I believe it's the kind of engagement that happens. Maybe it's through the communication channels, maybe the way we present such information is not relevant to them. The youth also have the problems they're facing. You will find that the youth will participate more in things that make sense to them. As Rwanda, we're different. I believe we're different because we have a unique history, and everybody in one way or another is affected, even as we move on. So I just believe that we need a way of communicating certain things to the youth that make sense to the context and the lives they live.
If I could just react to that, listening to you, it's amazing that young people today sort of expect things to sort of be done in a way, which is in contrast. Listening to his story, people just, they were young people and they had this resolve, even without the preconditions that, in my view, I feel the youth today pile a lot of pressure. They say, oh, if I have to do this job, I need A, B, C, D. So my question to you is, where is the motivation? Where is that sense of patriotism that makes you do things even when the circumstances are not perfect? What would it take, to have youth embrace you know, their country, do more for their country.
To be proactive.
Yes,
than
you know,
in
imperfect, you know, conditions.
Do you mind if I defend the youth?
No one is attacking.
No,
These
no,
are
no.
just questions.
No,
where we
because
think
it's not. And I think
perceptions.
Alan will talk about it. But I also want to mention something in response to Berna. You see, you need to understand, even for them, their motivation was stemmed from necessity. The environmental conditions pushed them to that point, and the colonel mentioned it. He talked about the fact that it was not easy to get jobs, let alone good jobs. You were always reminded that this was not your home, that you're a refugee. Those were harsh conditions that contributed to the motivation that got these people to that point. But now, when you think about the youth of today, my question, and now this is a counter question, and I understand what Alan is saying. The condition, because our parents have worked so hard to get the country to this point, we have certain luxuries that we sometimes even take for granted. So, for example, security. You know, you need to travel to see security. I'll give you a simple example, like even just internet access. In Uganda next door, there's a social media tax and a tax on mobile money. You know, these are things that, because we're in Rwanda, we take for granted that so many incentives have been put in place to make sure that we have these things. And you find that the youth have become complacent because they think that this is normal. But so the onus is still, I do genuinely also agree with him, the onus falls partly on the parents before. The same way when you think of how you raise your child at home, there's a responsibility to instill certain values that the child can then carry forth. That's why and I'm assuming that's what he meant when he said the leadership has to play some role in engaging the youth, in the sense that showing them the value of carrying this forward and being patriotic and motivated. That's my understanding of it.
Do you have any comments to make on that?
Yeah, I was actually going to the side of values as well. There's certain values that I would say the parents should instill in the youth. If you look at what the colonel was talking about, there's certain things of picking up, such as volunteerism, selflessness, nothing about yourself, but you think of the interests of others.
Collectively.
Because once it's collective, also you benefit. Think of Agachiro we always talk about. Think of other Rwandan values actually that we all know that make sense. Once you instill those, that's like the secret formula. Once the child understands that, they grow in an environment feeling that it's their responsibility to continue. You'd be surprised even someone throwing a bottle down, someone say, I don't care, I didn't throw it down. But once you have those certain values, you feel like it's your responsibility to carry that bottle and throw it away in the trash. So it all boils down to the education. How are you training your child? How are you preparing your child for the next steps ahead? So I also agree with him.
So do you think maybe the issue is in the case whereby they are, I'm not saying the youth are pathetic or passive, I'm just saying these are perceptions. I'm just putting forward what's out there. In the case where the young people who are just not passive and don't want to be really involved in nation building, is the fault then that of the current leaders in maybe not tailoring the communication and the context to young people to make it more relevant for them?
There's also another thing I tend to see around is globalization. We are now influenced by so many factors and things from elsewhere. The mindset is not focused solely on the ground, but the new generation is thinking global, is going with the global trend. So you find that something that may be serious to the national context, for that person, it doesn't make sense because his mind is global. This is too small for me to get involved. This doesn't make sense. If things happen here, I can hop on a bus across the border, I'll be fine. If I can find a job here, I don't need to create a job. I heard there's a job in Nairobi. I will go to Nairobi and apply for a job. So it's a mindset, and also the era we live in. We're connected, there's the internet. We're influenced by so many cultures, and that's why I keep on saying education from the grassroots is very important. So that even if they're involved with the rest of the world, they know limits. Like, hey, this is where I this is how far I can go with things.
Sorry, I'd like to just hear from the Colonel on this in defense of youth. Do you think it exists or it's actually not an issue?
It exists, and I think even before globalization, it did exist. Maybe the differences are in terms of levels. But let me pick up on what you were saying about globalization and the jobs. I think there are few people who can say, I can just jump on a bus and get a job in Kenya. Those jobs actually are, if you look at the youth, again, we should look at the youth. The youth also has categories. Yes. We are now talking about the elite part of the youth. But I think in understanding our youth, we should kind of dissect our youth and look at them from different perspectives. There is the elite part, we are talking about the youth also in the rural areas who are not actually maybe highly affected by the globalization. But I want also to concur with him that there is, I think, a challenge of complacence. And I think I want to explain it because usually there are threats that are visible. Military threats, for example, are more visible than non-military threats. And the challenge that the youth have today, they do not have the ability to look at non-military threats. In short, issues that we consider serious security threats like genocide ideology may find to some people it's not an issue. Even the poverty we are talking about, it may not be a big issue, but these are issues. So I think the youth leadership and all the leadership should concentrate on discussing the threats and it's not only enlightening them on the nature of threats, but also on how these threats are likely to affect them. So even the life you think you are enjoying today, you may not enjoy it tomorrow if you allow these other threats to continue, because they are big threats. They may not, they may not look big because they are not military, but I think this is how some countries have been affected by these threats, and later on they grow into something big. On that, I want also to bring out the issue of, I was talking about collective interest, but now we have a country, we have a nation. So I think the youth should also understand our country's, our national interest. Because all of us, I think our day-to-day business, whether you are a farmer, whether you are in the military, whether you are in the youth, is to make sure that we safeguard our national interest. And what do we mean by national interest? For example, if we talk about territorial integrity and national sovereignty, maybe there is a specific section of the Rwandans who are more in that field of security. But when you talk about threats like genocide ideology, those are serious threats, because anything that, for example, affects the unity of Rwandans is a big threat. But maybe my problem is, do the youth really see these as big threats? Because I think this is where we should do, and if they are big threats, then they should do something about it. Number two is about the number of the youth. That is also a security threat. So if the youth, the numbers are so big, and the youth are left out, then how are we going to achieve what we want to achieve? Because liberation is for all and by all. So unless everybody is brought on board, then that is also a big threat. Otherwise, I think other issues can be looked at in terms of education. Even, by the way, the formal education that we get, good enough, we have the Itorero Commission. Yes. But we are also victims of the education that, formal education that some of us have had. Depending on the education we have had, we have not empowered our youth to think critically. So again, the issue of mindset and so on, these are issues that we can also grapple with.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the break and come back. We are having a very enlightening conversation with Colonel Rutaremara here and Alain from Rwanda Patriotic Front on today's liberation celebrations marking 24 years against the 1994 Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi. We'll be back after the break. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to The Square. Tonight, as we said earlier on, we are marking 24 years of liberation in Rwanda since the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, and we're here talking about past experiences from people who are key members of the struggle, the liberation struggle, even more than 24 years ago. And with us, we have Colonel Rutaremara. We are also talking about the role of youth in driving forward this narrative and continuing the legacy of our predecessors. And with us, we have Alain Ndayishimiye, who is a commissioner at Rwanda Patriotic Front. Before we go to our Twitter feed, Bernard, there's something you wanted to mention before the break.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment on the issue of globalization, because I feel that globalization offers lots of opportunities. And I think even for Rwandans, it doesn't really matter where you are, as long as you understand the country's vision. You can always make your contribution whether you are abroad or, so, but I think what is key is that wherever you are, you understand where you come from and you understand your national interests. Two, I would like to come back to the threats that he's talking about. If you look at 24 years and then perhaps 24 years ahead, definitely the nature of the threats is changing. Could you give us a sense of what kind of threats we should anticipate going forward? Because one, we are interested in sustainability. How do we ensure that the liberation struggle, becomes sustainable? How do we ensure that the gains are not? And so within that context, what kind of threats are we talking about in the 21st century?
Well, threats sometimes are fluid. For example, we live in a region that is unpredictable, that's fluid. And so when you talk about threats, we should always be able to deal with any threat that can, for example, impinge on our territorial integrity and national sovereignty. And I think that's why the institutions charged with that responsibility must always train, equip, ready for any eventualities, because external forces can easily dismantle the achievements that you've made. That's one of the threats. So much as those threats may change, but they continue to exist. For example, even in the neighborhood here, if you talk about the FDLR in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it has not died, but it's not so much of a military threat, but it is much more of a threat in terms of genocide ideology. So genocide ideology, and if you look at these groups even outside Rwanda, I think genocide ideology is still something that is real. So we should take that one as a serious security threat. Then other threats are those that I think are related to maybe to the well-being of Rwandans in terms of unemployment, things that you have been raising, in terms of poverty, in terms of diseases, and so on, infrastructure. And these are all things that I think can be tackled. But I think I look at the unit of Rwandans as something that is most paramount.
When I listen to you, for most youth, again, going back to the role of the youth, when you discuss issues of sovereignty, security threats, they're very complex issues for youth to sort of feel they have a role in this. But for many youth, if you say...
but the crimes also, if you look at the transnational crimes and you look at the drugs, human trafficking, all these are threats.
Absolutely.
Cyber security, all those are, because these are not military, but they still pose a big security threat.
Yes, so in the kind of language that the youth understand, because today the youth will be, one, worried, I don't have a job. Where are the opportunities? If there are no opportunities, then crime, of course, becomes always, the risk becomes higher. That is one. Two, we are looking at a world where, one, misinformation, fake news is continuing to be a major threat. So how do you ensure that, one, you address the concerns of the youth, for instance, around the well-being, and then at the same time facing these emerging global threats, misinformation, fake news, that have, you know, sort of a major impact on progress that for any country?
First of all, it is important for the youth to understand that even when you are poor, it's not a justification for example, indulging in drugs. It can be maybe an explanation, but not a justification. So that's what our youth, for example, should understand. So you can't, for example, convince me that because you don't have a job, therefore you go into the issue of drugs. Because even there are so many drugs now, because we talked about globalization. There are many bad things that are coming in, but there are also other good things that are coming also in because of globalization. So I think we should discuss all these things, but and if it is jobs anyway. Yeah, even jobs, those are issues that they should be discussing.
What is the readiness? How ready are we to confront these threats?
I think that's a wide.
That is
it's a wide question.
I got a question.
That is actually a very, because these threats are different, yes, and there are many people who are handling these threats. For example, if you ask me how ready are we to confront genocide ideology, at least I can tell you from the studies that have been done, the research work, you see that many Rwandans have embraced national unity and reconciliation. But you see, even the few ones who have not, it remains a big threat, because if you don't deal with it, many more people can be brought on board. And that's what threats are all about.
So we need to get to our closing remarks based on this conversation. Very, very interesting and very, very important, I think, at this point, especially with the role of youth. Alfred, I'll start with you, if you can give closing remarks.
So in a few words, what I would say needs to be addressed when it comes to the youth, or one thing that we do not take into consideration when we talk about apathy and the youth and what is the solution or what is the problem, is understanding that framing a value structure, be it on an individual basis or be it at a national level, where we now start to talk about national interest, happens progressively. It happens over time. It's a gradual process. It doesn't happen overnight, especially when it comes to now educating the youth around what they should consider important in order for us to move forward. And for me, when you ask me now when you start to talk about these threats and how should we address them, are we ready for that? Or at least what is the role of the leadership in ensuring that the youth are ready to carry on the next mantle, to handle the next struggle for the liberation of Rwanda, or to continue on what we have? I would say it comes down to an involvement from the beginning, which I think we do, but maybe not enough. So just involving the young people. Like recently, the commissioners who were elected to the RPF, our brother next to us is one of them, are young people. A good portion of them are young people, actually, if not all. 10 of them. So you find a situation where there's that involvement. They may not be the most skilled or the most knowledgeable about some of the issues, but just involving them helps with getting them to that point where that value structure gets formed to carry on the mantle.
Alain, closing comments?
Yes, I will actually just comment on what you just said. I believe getting involved at an early stage is the right way to move forward. not just in decision making, but also in actually participation as well. So involving the youth in such a manner that they can actually analyze the situations around them. You talked about threats. Maybe, I kept on thinking about threats. Maybe the way we define threats in our generation is probably different from the generation that was previous to us. Because I believe, for example, if we talk about going to bed hungry, that's a threat on its own, because you can't go to school, you can't function during the day. So the way we define threats, we need to really understand what is a threat to me, and not just me, but what is a threat as a society. So by engaging them in identifying areas that actually can be problems in the future, and actually coming up with solutions before things happen. So engagement, you talked about, and give an example of RPF. This is a good sign, which I also congratulate the party of engaging the youth and training them such that they sit with the old and actually manage situation from both sides, from a perspective of the old and also the new as well.
I'd like to ask Colonel Rutaramara, we have a few seconds left, your closing remarks.
Yeah, I think we should not be pessimistic about the youth, because the youth are doing a lot of good things. There may be some weaknesses here and there, but these ones can be dealt with, especially if we understand that the youth is not a homogeneous group, and if the youth can sit together, discuss their own problems, involve them in finding solutions to these problems, and enlighten them on issues that affect them also, like the threats we have been talking about is true. When we are even in the military, when we talk about threats, we don't go to military only, but even the issue of poverty, hunger, that's why even the RDF is involved in agriculture activities and in these outreach programs, because you cannot talk about liberation, security, someone who is hungry, someone who is suffering from jiggers, there is no security. So I think, again, you should not be pessimistic. A lot of good things are being done, but I think more effort should be put in involving the youth. And I think especially the youth forum and the leadership at various levels, plus of course the families, have a lot to do, including the schools where the youth go through. So I want to take again this opportunity to thank you for inviting the RDF and to wish all Rwandans a happy Liberation Day.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our show. Thank you very much for tuning in. Very good dynamic conversations on the role of youth in carrying forward the mantle of our predecessors, 24 years in Rwanda's history. And I think it's safe to say that we really look forward to being part of the next 24 years. Thank you for joining us wherever you are, watching TV Rwanda and watching The Square tonight. And we'll see you next week, same time, same place. Have a good evening.